The settlement on Kepler 442b had been running for 3 years when Jake Morrison first saw the little alien girl wandering near the human compound. And he knew immediately something was wrong, because her movements were hesitant and fearful, like a wounded animal testing unfamiliar ground. The Varani were a peaceful species with pale lavender skin and large eyes that reflected starlight like mirrors, and they had welcomed humans to their world with open arms, sharing resources and knowledge freely. But this child looked different from the confident Varani he had met before. Her name was Lisa, and she appeared to be around 7 years old by human standards, though Varani aged differently, and she stood at the edge of the market district. Watching human children play with a longing so intense it made his chest ache. Jake worked as a medic for the colony, and he had learned basic Varani language during his 2 years on this world, so he approached slowly with his hands visible and empty. "Hello, little one," he said in her tongue. "Are you lost?" Lisa turned those massive eyes toward him, and they were filled with such ancient sadness that he almost stepped back, and she shook her head slowly. "Not lost," she whispered, her voice like wind chimes just watching. The other Varani children never came this close to the human settlement, and their parents kept them in their own districts not out of fear but out of respect for boundaries. So seeing Lisa alone raised questions in his mind. "Where is your family?" he asked gently. "Gone," she said simply, and she looked down at her small 3-fingered hands. Jake felt his heart sink, and he knelt down to her level, making himself less imposing, and the little girl studied him with those reflective eyes searching for something he could not name. "Are you hungry?" he asked, and when she nodded, he offered his hand. She hesitated for a long moment before placing her tiny hand in his, and her skin was cool and smooth like polished stone, and together, they walked toward the medical center where he kept supplies. The facility was quiet at this hour, and Jake brought out some fruit that both species could eat safely, and Lisa ate with the desperation of someone who had not seen food in days, and each bite she took made his anger grow at whoever had allowed this to happen. As she ate, he noticed the way she moved carefully, as if every motion caused discomfort, and when she reached for another piece of fruit, her shirt rode up slightly, and he saw something that made his blood run cold. Purple bruises covered her side in various stages of healing, from fresh dark marks to fading yellow ones, and they formed patterns too regular to be accidental. "Lisa," he said softly, trying to keep the rage from his voice. "Who hurt you?" She froze mid-bite, and her eyes went wide with fear, and she clutched the fruit to her chest like a shield. "No one," she whispered, but her voice trembled with the lie. Jake took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm, because scaring her would accomplish nothing, and he had seen enough abuse cases in his career to recognize the signs. "I am a healer," he said, using the Varani word that meant both doctor and protector, "and if someone hurt you, I can help. But I need to see." Tears welled in those massive eyes, and they spilled down her lavender cheeks in silver streams, and she shook her head frantically. "They will be angry," she whispered. "They said never tell." "Who will be angry?" he asked. But she just cried harder. Jake waited, letting her release the fear and pain she had been holding inside, and after several minutes she looked at him with something like hope flickering in her expression. "You help?" she asked, as if the concept was foreign. "Yes," he promised, "I help." Slowly, with trembling hands, Lisa lifted the hem of her shirt, and what Jake saw made him feel physically sick. Her torso was covered in scars, old and new, and they crisscrossed her lavender skin in deliberate patterns, and some were from burns, others from cuts, and a few looked like they came from some kind of electronic device. But worse than the scars were the fresh wounds still healing. An infection had started in several places, turning the edges green, and Jake recognized the signs of systematic torture. He had to turn away for a moment to compose himself because his fury threatened to overwhelm his professional training, and this child had been hurt repeatedly and deliberately by someone she should have been able to trust. When he turned back, Lisa was lowering her shirt with shaking hands, and her eyes were fixed on the floor as if she expected him to hurt her too. "You are very brave," he told her, his voice thick with emotion. "Showing me this." She looked up, surprised. "Not brave," she whispered. "Broken?" "No," Jake said firmly. Not broken and never broken, and you are surviving, and that takes more strength than you know. He spent the next hour cleaning and treating her wounds, and each injury he touched made him more determined to find whoever did this. And she winced sometimes but never cried out, and her tolerance for pain spoke to how often she had been hurt. As he worked, he asked gentle questions, and slowly the story emerged. Lisa had been sold to a Varani couple who collected rare specimens, and they kept her locked in a small room and used her for what they called experiments, but were really just cruelty disguised as science. The Varani as a species opposed such treatment, and if the authorities knew, they would act swiftly. But Lisa had been taken from a distant colony world, and no one knew she was here. She had escaped 3 days ago when her captors left a door unsealed, and she had been hiding in the spaces between buildings, eating scraps and avoiding detection. Why come here? Jake asked why the human settlement, because she said simply, "Humans stop bad things." Jake felt his throat tighten because humanity's reputation in the galaxy was mixed, and they were known as warriors and protectors, but also as dangerous and unpredictable. This child had seen humans as her last hope for safety. He finished treating her wounds and gave her clean clothes from the pediatric supply closet, and then he contacted the colony administrator. Lisa Grant was a practical woman in her 40s with iron gray hair and a no-nonsense attitude, but when she saw Lisa and heard the story, her expression turned to stone. "We find them tonight," she said, and her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Within hours, the Varani authorities had been contacted, and a joint human-Varani task force descended on the residence where Lisa had been kept, and what they found there confirmed every horrible detail she had shared. The couple was arrested, and their collection of torture devices and research notes documented years of abuse against multiple victims, and Lisa was just the latest. Other children were found, some Varani and some from other species, and all of them bore similar scars, and the rescue operation made galactic news and humanity's swift response earned respect from species who had questioned their motives. But for Jake, none of that mattered as much as the little girl who now slept in a bed at the medical center with clean bandages and a full stomach. Over the following weeks, Lisa slowly began to trust and smile, and human families volunteered to take her in, but she refused to leave Jake's side. The colony psychologist said this was normal, and she had imprinted on him as her rescuer and protector, and separating them now could cause more trauma. So Jake, who had lived alone in a small apartment, suddenly found himself with a daughter. He learned to cook Varani food and studied their customs and language more seriously, and Lisa taught him songs from her homeworld. In exchange, she still had nightmares, and sometimes she would wake screaming, and Jake would hold her until the terror passed, and on those nights he wondered if she would ever truly heal. But there were good moments too. The day she laughed for the first time at one of the human children's jokes. The afternoon she asked if she could call him father in Varani. The evening she fell asleep during a movie, her small hand clutched in his. Months passed, and Lisa grew stronger, and the physical scars remained, but they faded, and more importantly, the fear in her eyes diminished. She made friends with other children, both human and Varani, and she started attending the colony school where she excelled in art and mathematics. The colony held a ceremony 6 months after her rescue, and the Varani government awarded Jake their highest civilian honor for protecting one of their children. But as he stood on that stage with Lisa beside him, wearing a new dress and holding his hand, he knew the real reward was in her smile. She had taught him something profound about resilience and hope, and how even the deepest wounds can heal with time and love. That night after the ceremony, Lisa climbed into her bed and looked up at him with those mirror-bright eyes. "Thank you," she said in perfect English, because she had been practicing for what he asked. "For seeing me," she said simply, "when I was invisible." Jake felt tears sting his eyes, and he kissed her forehead gently. "You were never invisible," he promised, "just waiting to be found." And as he turned off the light and left her door cracked open the way she liked, he realized that she had saved him too, because before Lisa, he had been going through the motions of life without real purpose, and now every day had meaning. She was his daughter in every way that mattered, and he would spend the rest of his life making sure she knew she was loved and protected and valued. The scars would always be there, physical reminders of cruelty she should never have endured. But they would not define her. She was more than what had been done to her. She was Lysa Morrison now and she was home.